So without further ado, I'd like to pass it off to Hannah Lee. I also want to introduce some of our panelists that are joining us. We also have Khalid Madai. I don't know, you may have already met him in some of the other sessions. So he's also a lawyer here in Toronto. And we're very thrilled to have Khalid joining us for this session, as he can also give us his personal perspective on this as an individual living with Duchenne. So thank you, Khalid, for joining us for this session. And we also have Penny Sparling, who I'm sure a lot of you had met yesterday or through some of the other sessions. She is a social worker that also works at Holland Bloorview with many of our GTA families and Ontario families, including my own. So thank you, Penny, for joining us. So with that, I would love to turn it over to Hannah.
Thank you so much, everybody, for coming today and taking the step to demystifying a process that scares a lot of you. Please don't be scared. I'm hoping that today you're going to come away with just a general sense of what the landscape looks like. And I'm so sorry that I think that's better. What the landscape may look like for you when you're planning to transition into the adult system. You have a child with a disability, you want to feel a little bit more confident in how to plan and the legal aspects of planning. So some of you may not be from Ontario. Today's presentation is general legal information for people in Ontario, Canada. It's not intended to be legal advice for a specific legal problem. Information today is presented to be true and correct as of the date of presentation, and there can be changes later on. I know you might have access to a link to this presentation. It's going to be active for about a month because of certain changes that might happen later on, and I don't want to put information that's out there that might not necessarily be accurate. When we talk about planning, and I know that this talk was built specifically, taking into account the financial aspects, the funding aspects, and I'm a lawyer, so I'll be dealing more with the legal aspects, and I know that the funding piece is huge. That's why I have prepared a great PDF that I'd like you guys to access through this system. It's a great way for you to get your feet wet in terms of what programs are available in Ontario for kids with disabilities, families from a provincial and a federal level. So when we talk about future planning, there is that financial piece. We're talking about government programs. Today, we're going to be talking about ODSP, RDSP, DTC. Then there's the estate planning piece. Why do we think about that? Why is that something important? You may have heard of something called the Hansen Trust. We'll try to demystify that today. There's the incapacity planning piece. We're not going to talk about that. That's a huge, area of concern for people. But since we have 20 minutes, we're just going to limit it to the first two on, the first two aspects in a general way. So here's a great sort of funding milestone checklist in terms of things that you might want to be thinking about depending on the age of the child or the young adult that's living with you. Pre-18, we talk about special services at home for a lot of our kids at Holland Bloorview. ACSD is another, depending on the family income as well. Canada Child Benefit and Canada Disability Benefits. But you can, if you're at any age, you can access the DTC provided that you meet the criteria. Same with the RDSP, except not after a certain age. Parents' wills, you don't have to wait till they're 18 to start thinking about that. At 16, you might want to start thinking about applying for the DSO. That allows you $5,000 in passport funding. If you have questions about that, you can address that to Penny, who would be able to have better understanding of how that works and how to apply. You might want to also think about starting to file your loved one's tax. He or she can start filing at 17 in order to be in a position to, at age 19, start getting the bond. We can talk about that later, as well as at 17 and a half, that's the time that you want to start thinking about applying for the ODSP. Basically, the first step from this slide is to make sure that you are doing your homework so that you're familiar with all of these benefits, so that you know what's out there when you're future planning the finance piece. So the ODSP, what is that? What's that about? It's available for people in Ontario, 18 to 65. You got to meet two pieces of the test. So there's a disability piece. and there is the income and asset piece. So if you qualify for DSO at 16, you don't have to go through the process of proving that you have the disability. That should be taken care of. And when you look at the rates, there are two different rates. I can answer questions as to why one is larger or bigger than the other. Basically, it has to do with how they understand your relationship. Is this a board and lodge situation? Is this a tenancy situation? If you're applying and you're applying in a family situation where mom and dad are, say, providing meals, you might have a harder time in proving that you're in a tenancy situation. In terms of eligibility for assets, if you're single, you can't be eligible if you have or possess more than $40,000 in assets. And if you receive more than 10 grand in gifts. So an inheritance example is an example of that, right? If you receive more than 40 or 10,000, that may, depending on the amount, put you offside the rules and then you're out. So this is where the whole estate planning piece comes into play. There are things called exempt assets, for example, income. They want to encourage people to make income to the extent that they can with a disability. If you make over 200 net, then you're going to be clawed back 50 cents on the dollar. But the two things you need to keep in mind in terms of planning is the RDSP and the money that you leave in a will and a Henson trust are considered exempt income. So that's why it's kind of important to start thinking about these in terms of how do you maximize what's available for your child, and working with all of these benefits. Why would you want to do that? Well, think about what ODSP includes, right? Not just sort of a monthly benefit for food and shelter, but really also access to, prescription drug plan, basic dental, vision care, coverage for ADP, and medical supplies. So it's important once you get on the plan that you understand, you work with your caseworker and say, ask, what they can cover beyond what you get in terms of the monthly benefit, because they can help with that as well. We touched briefly on the reason why you want to start thinking about estate planning with a trust. When you apply for ODSP, there are other reasons why estate planning is important. A good percentage of Canadians don't do their estate planning, and then they're in the position of dying intestate. Basically, their wishes are not known. They don't put them, in a will. So they die intestate, meaning that there are certain sort of laws that come into place that divide up things in a way that you may not have divided up in the way you want it. And of course, if that happens, and if there's no way of passing on that wealth to your child with a disability, it might, through a mechanism like a trust, it might be that your child may be offside or offline that rule that says you can't have more than, and they might be disqualified. So that's really one of the compelling reasons why you wanted to start thinking about that. There are other reasons as well. When you start thinking about, well, what is this trust? What does this mean? There's a kind of different ways you can think about it. The way we normally think about it is a testamentary trust. So what does that mean? It means it comes into effect upon the death of the testator or the settler. So who are they? Those are the people who set it up, right? A settler is a person who sets up the trust. They appoint a trustee in their will. They say, I want, Joan and Marcia to be the trustees of this trust for the benefit of Doug, my son, right? So there's a beneficiary. Those are the players that are involved. What are we talking about in terms of assets? We can talk about insurance policies and investments, a home that can be contained in as an asset that's caught in the will to be managed on behalf of the loved one by the trustee. They will be given powers, legal authority to do that. The thing you need to keep in mind, and what you need to keep in mind is that how is it that ODSP considers this an exempt asset when you can leave like any amount, basically, there's no cap? Why is it that this is not offside the rules? Well, it's because of the powers that these trustees have when it comes to decisions such as when should the beneficiary get any amount and why and for what purpose. Those are all decisions that these people that you think about to manage this have to make. You can't be going in there in your will telling them this is what you want them to do. No, that's not allowed. They have complete discretion to do that. So you really need to trust the people that you appoint as your trustees to really look out for your loved one's best interests. So this is why maybe having more than one person do this is a good idea. Maybe having a mechanism in place where, you know, it's not just one person who's not accountable to somebody else. Other things to keep in mind besides the trustworthy piece would be things like age, right? How close in age is that person to the beneficiary? Skill level, how comfortable would they be? You don't have to be a lawyer, an accountant, you know, and be this great investment person, but how comfortable would they be and getting that advice if they feel like they don't have it? Consulting that lawyer if they feel like they don't understand how to give money to the beneficiary without violating the rules, right? So those are some things. And how close is that person to seeing the living circumstances of the beneficiary to actually make informed decisions about how that money should be made? So these are all considerations you think about when the choosing of the trustee. The other exempt asset we talk about, you know, in planning for the future, you know, for your loved one, and this is just really financial scaffolding. It's not really a holistic picture. If you want a holistic picture of future planning, I really recommend this book. It's called, this is it, Safe and Secure. The future planning piece, this financial legal piece, is really just one of the whole pieces that are available that should, you know, from a holistic point of view, that provides a scaffolding for that good future life, right? So just to put everything in perspective. And by the way, you can get this. You can get this for free as a download. It's, if you look at my resource, it's a great book. But anyway, I imagine most of you have applied for the DTC. I'm not going to go into the eligibility, but if you have never heard of this, please, it's very important that you know about it. What's the advantage of it? Well, without this, you can't apply for the RDSP, right? This is really key. And, you know, it will reduce, it's a tax credit, basically, non-refundable tax credit. It lowers the amount of taxes that you will be paying. It can be transferred from the parent to the child, right? If you're dependent, if they're depending on you for necessities of life. Just be careful that you don't ask somebody to be, you know, people are charging you money for this, because a lot of what happens is sometimes, say you were eligible for all these years, you didn't know it. Well, the government can sort of give you a lump sum of back, you know, 10 years of all the tax that you could have not been paying and give it back to you. And some of these promoters, you know, will want to cut in that, and really they shouldn't be getting it. So you should not have to pay someone to help you with this. But it is the criteria to get the RDSP. So it's very important. It's very important that you do. So the RDSP, what is it? And I imagine most of you do have this or have thought about it or know that you're eligible to do it, but just haven't gone around to it. So please get around to it if you haven't. Why? Well, it's a long-term, it's like a government pension, basically. It's got a span, it's a long span in terms of the timeline, and we can talk a bit about that timeline a bit later, but you know, in a nutshell, it's a way to help lessen the uneven playing field that exists financially for people with disabilities who are, unlike the general population, shouldered with a greater disproportionate amount of expenses and face greater hardship. Okay, so how does the government alleviate that disparity, right? How do they do that? They do it two ways, for depending on your income. So, you know, if you are someone in the lower income bracket, say, if you are in the 31,000 or less income bracket, then guess what? You get the bond, and that doesn't require you to pay into it to get it. And, you know, mom and dad might be making more than 31, but guess what? When the loved one becomes 19, the government looks at the loved one's income, right? when they look at it 2 years prior to 19, so 17. So my advice is always to start filing at 17 so that they're eligible. They can start the $1,000 bond for how long? 20 years. It's 20,000 for 20 years. And then, same with this, the grant. This is for, say the family makes less than 97,000, right? Then you're in a position where this does require paying. So if you contribute, for example, $500, you get a 3-to-1 matching with the government. So 3-to-1 for the first 500, you've got 1,500, right? The next 1,000, 2-to-1, 2,000. So if you invest 1,500 yearly, if you're in that income bracket, say $125 monthly, you could get like a contribution of 3,500. So over 20 years, that's going to add up, right? $70,000. So there's something called the RDSP calculator. It's a great little tool. And it kind of shows you with the numbers how things can just accumulate once you invest this and compounding over time. But like I said, there are timelines. It's meant to be a long-term savings vehicle. So what happens if, say, you don't let it stay there for 10 years? The idea is that you let it stay for 10 years after the last government contribution, let it vest without taking the money out. If you take it out prematurely, then you're going to be penalized. So that's why it's important to start it earlier, right? Because that period will happen earlier. But say your life, it's just not going to work because of, say, there's a need for an exception based on life expectancy of 5 years or less. There is a provision that allows you, a payment of up to $10,000 a year if you provide the medical documentation and a prognosis. So and those monies can be used for. It doesn't have to be used for disability related expenses. There's no sort of ODSP is not going to look at what is this being used for. It has the same as perhaps a Henson Trust. They might look at the Henson Trust. You can preserve that through a trust, but the asset through a trust, but they might look at what it's being used for, unless if it doesn't fit into, say, an exemption, like disability related expenses would be an exemption, right? You would be able to use that money, but you'd have greater freedom with the RDSP in terms of ODSP not being too hung up about how that's being used. I think in terms of the ins and outs of the RDSP, I think I'm done, but I did want to show you another, unless I have finished 5 minutes early, and that'll leave more time for questions. If you wanted to take a quick look at the document that I prepared, we can do that as well, but I'm prepared, to hear questions from the audience about this or any other sort of transition related issue.
Thank you so much, Hannah. Thank you. That was fantastic. And I'd like to open it up to our families for question and answer. So please put your questions in the chat box and we'll start to go through those. So thank you very much. We do have one question from Tara. Is an ambulatory kid eligible for none of these supports?
Ambulatory kid.
Yeah, and I think she might be referring to perhaps the disability tax credits. So they do have to fit some criteria. So even though there is a diagnosis and it's a progressive condition, they still have to meet certain criteria. And I think that a lot of families have been successful at meeting this and other families have not. So I think it comes down to being able to access this anytime. Sometimes we have to wait until we've hit a certain milestone before we're eligible for some of these supports. So I don't know, Hannah, if you can speak to that a little bit.
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Okay, so look, let's interpret your question as not as Nicola says, just talking about the DTC as opposed to everything, right? Keep in mind, the DTC is their definition of disabilities is the most onerous compared to, say, the ODSP, right? And as Nicola said, there is a criteria, and I'm going to try to find that section here of the idea of activities of daily living, right? For Duchenne, I know that there are some of the children will, have to be not walking. They cannot walk. They will need the aid of a mobility device, right? And but in other aspects of their daily living, their feeding, their mental functions, they might be okay, right? And the other thing is, how are they vis-a-vis like their peers, right? In terms of age, right? It might be things are not apparent when you're really young as they would when you're older, say for mental functions, for example, right? So I do think this is, and perhaps Penny can speak to this about Holland Bloorview, if there is some kind of clinical sort of best practice about, do we wait until they're in a wheelchair before we sign off on them being 90%? Like, it's a high threshold, right? Prolonged, they have to reach 90%, right, of inability, and I think it's not a diagnosis. It has to do with the actual impact of the diagnosis on the activity of daily living. So just because you have the diagnosis doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be eligible for the disability tax credit. But for Duchenne's, there might be milestones, as Nicola says, about the walking, right? Like, in order to fit that, it might be that with therapy, your kid's great. Like they don't need it, or it comes later, like when they're 15 and they're doing basketball until then, and it's not 90%. They need some help, but so it's all kind of like a judgment call. But what I always say to parents is that you're the expert of your kid, like in terms of what you see. They're the expert in terms of the medicine part, but really you guys should be talking together about how he is outside of the hospital, like what you're seeing and how long it takes for him to do things, right? How long does it take for him to put on his socks and get dressed and feed himself? Is it like three times longer than other kids his age? Is it, with a lot of like prompting? Is it with a lot of, support, that kind of thing? They don't know that, right? They don't know how they act outside in your own home. You see that. So really, there's a great resource that I put in the handout that helps you talk to your doctor or your clinician about this. When you want to apply for the DTC, what are the things that I should note? What are the things I should talk to so that they know how he is at home or she is at home? It's a great resource, and it'll help organize you before you get in. But I do think it's worth talking to your doctor, see what the practice is. What are you guys waiting for? What milestone are you assessing here for us to start becoming eligible for this?
And I think that the key piece here too is that there seems to be some inconsistencies across the country in terms of how this is being made available. And we have a comment here from Lori. She says, my son has had DTC since he was 5 or 6, and he is still fully ambulatory at 11. And Hannah, this is a federal program. Is that?
Yes, it is. So it'd be the same wherever you are in Canada. It's right. Just that clinicians may be interpreting. And don't forget, there are other, I hear that Duchenne is not just one. Sometimes kids have multiple disabilities that affect different areas, right? Not just a muscle tone issue. It could be developmental disability. It could be they really don't have the mental, there's an overlay of something else that's affecting their mind and their mental functions. And, and it might be that it's not, it doesn't meet the marked restriction of 1. You can get 2 of them, significantly restricted for 2, right? So it could be that it's not ambulatory a little bit, but if you add this to it together, it's like they're 90%. So I don't know what Lori's situation is here, but it's not as simple as saying, oh, you have the same diagnosis and and I should. But that doesn't take away from the fact that Nicole is right. there's a lot of frustration about the inconsistent and inequitable application. Don't forget, these guys at the CRA and girls, they're not medical people. They're just lay people, and they're just reading your stories, right? They don't have the expertise, right? But I do know for autism that's been a huge problem, the inconsistency of whether someone gets, TCC and why, and they're younger. Like, it was a real problem. So my advice is, you can try again. There's nothing holding you back from trying again after you have a good conversation and, perhaps see if there's other ADLs that might be in play here, that you might be able to, get a fuller picture. But the key is a very good description of what's going to happen, of what's happening in terms of the activities of daily living. And also being aware that there are questionnaires that will be follow-up. There's going to be a follow-up if the doctor doesn't provide, or the clinician to provide the adequate information. So there might be a questionnaire where you have to tick, tick, tick. And sometimes they tick the wrong box because it's so obvious. Sometimes they say 90% or more. And then we'll say, it's 80, like, it's like, that's not going to help, right? You need your medical professional to actually be providing the evidence to support it, right? So I think, just being really clear about that is going to help. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah,
that was very helpful. And I know we have a few more minutes left, but I really would love to hear from Khalid as well as Penny. So Khalid and Penny, I would love to hear your perspective on this as well.
Khalid wanted to speak. I just wanted to briefly mention regarding the ACSD, which I know is provincial, and not everybody here is obviously from Ontario, but the Assistance for Children with Severe Disabilities is a provincial funding that it's based on the parent's income, so you have to be below the income threshold. But we do have a number of families who are receiving that whose children are ambulatory. So I just wanted to point that out. I don't know in other provinces, but with that one, they look at sort of how the disability affects your day-to-day functioning, as well as the income threshold. And so they're looking at not so much diagnosis or whether you're ambulatory or not, but whether you have expenses related to the disability, as well as your income, and that the disability affects your day-to-day functioning, basically. So certainly, hopefully, there's social workers that can support you in your local team to look at your specific, provincial funding. But I know for sure for Ontario that like being ambulatory shouldn't exclude you per se from accessing some of the funding.
Perfect.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I was gonna add to what Penny was saying. I mean, I think up until I was about probably 15, all the way up through high school when you're transitioning out of it. I was ambulatory. I was still qualified for those programs, right? I think you have to demonstrate, I think, the expenses that are there. So, you have to, so any therapies, any special therapies that you need, sort of, I guess they would be called life-sustaining therapies, right? I think, the fact that you're on the Flazaport, I think there are many different things that would put you on that thing. And so I don't think being ambulatory is necessarily a precondition to that. I think there are a number of no complications with Duchenne that are, that would place you in, a qualifying category for those programs.
Thank you, Khalid. Oh, that was my alarm to warn us that we were coming to the end of our session. Decided that was a good plan because we've been going over a lot. There's another comment in the chat box from Hannah that says, if the expenses are very high, you can try to appeal a denial based on income.
That's for ACSD.
Okay, perfect. Are there any other questions from our audience, from our families? And please, I know this is, I think this is an area that we don't spend enough time talking about. And I mean, we could talk about this for quite some time, and it's really important. And I mean, I personally find a lot of this it's not my skill set. So I hear all this information. I feel like I need to go back, Hannah, to your presentation and look through it again really carefully. And so, you know, I'm sure a lot of us will be doing that. You had some resources that you had mentioned. Are you able, can we post that on Whova, or can we maybe post it here in the chat, and we'll move it over to Whova so that our families can make sure to access this, because you had a lot of great resources there.
Yeah, please do.
Including the book you mentioned as well might be really great, you know, or you can send it to me and I'll post it on Whova, whatever works well. Safe and secure. Okay.
It's also in my little, you know, like resource list, the PDF.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean it.
Okay.
If you, on my speaker, you know, it's just at the bottom there.
Okay, perfect. So we'll make sure to send, to also save that under resources. And Penny, did you want to say something quick before we go?
No, I was just going to say, yeah, I think it's already posted there, but also just, you know, that people can also reach out to their social worker on their team as well. And hopefully that's a resource to help you plan and prepare as you're transitioning from a financial and planning perspective.
You know, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead, Hannah, sorry.
If you're, you know, Holland Bloorview is really doing a good job trying to get families more up to speed on this. So there's something called the On Track Navigation Clinic and Lifespan, and we have something called the Family Navigation Hub. Like there's a lot out there for families, you know, who are struggling with this. Yeah.
Thank you, Hannah. And Khalid, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, you know, I think what Hannah put in the chat, I think, you know, she mentioned the, you know, appeal mechanisms available. So, you know, if you know, those are options available if you know, you found you're denied, you know, with the program or denied any sort of funding. I think there are appeal mechanisms there. If you find them funding is inadequate, you know, there are appeal mechanisms there. If you find, you know, I think this goes to you know, even community attended resources. So through your LIN, you know, those sort of things, even through ODSP, you know, a lot of things could be appealed in that regard, right? So there are options out there if, you know, if you find that you're, you know, deemed ineligible and you know, and you know, if you know, there may be a way to do so. But I would always encourage you to engage with your local social worker, or you know, even if you know, legal representation at that point, if that's something you know, you want to appeal.
Thank you so much, Khalid. That's really, really helpful. So thank you, everyone. I hope that everyone here participating in this session enjoyed this and got a lot out of it, as I did. So really appreciate, Hannah, for you joining us today, and Khalid and Penny for your advice and input. It was really, really helpful.